We lived in a brand new house for several years that had unexplained activity. The beds would move as if someone sat on it, or maybe an animal jumped out of the radio that was plugged in and would turn it on. Lots of little things that bother me the most. Then the shower was running. You could hear voices, like multiple voices talking and laughing. It creeped us way the heck out. When I would go to the bathroom during the night, I could not look at the mirror, as it was huge, ceiling to the counter wall to wall, and I would actually put my hand up to block the vision on my left. During the day, I would go out and think that I'm an idiot and that I'm fine. Then night would come, and I was afraid to go into these properties, since the house was new, or just an entity who randomly chooses that house, or can it be debunked? In the past few months, I have started seeing this bright flash which barely lasts a second. I always see it in the same spot from behind the wardrobe. Last night it was about 1:12 a.m. and I heard some music. I usually stay up late. Then I was listening to this song, and all of a sudden there was this bright flash. I was scared of this thing, and somehow I managed to pluck up the courage to say hello out loud. It flashed once again, and I was so scared that the hairs on the back of my head were feeling tingly. And what's more strange is that I was hearing Fix by Coldplay before this first flash, and the song barely started when the first flash came. And only 30 seconds have passed after that, which I came back to my senses, but that was strange. It was weird that it happened with the song. After the flash again happened at 1:17 a.m. I'm pretty sure about what I saw and experienced. I'm an 18-year-old, and my visions are normal and my eyes are good. I'm not highly religious, but this does freak me out. This happened to me in 2012. I was traveling with a friend from El Paso, Texas, to Ruidoso, New Mexico. It's a trip that takes a little less than 3 hours. It was dark, and it was also a very lonely road. After 2 hours on the road, we passed through this abandoned town with an old Wild West style tavern in the middle, and we thought it was pretty creepy. But I told my friend we should turn around and go enter the abandoned tavern. We did that, and when we were turning around, there was a sign that told the name of the town was Oro Grande. We stopped in a place and we stepped out the car. There were no lights at all, and when we had walked a couple of meters beyond our car, we heard 5 to 10 dogs barking at us from nowhere. We noped out of there immediately, got in the car and went to Ruidoso, and arrived 20 to 30 minutes after that incident. 3 days after, on our way back from the trip, it wasn't nighttime yet. So I told him that we should step onto the tavern and ask for a beer, because we had chickened out last time. And we started going back, and there was no sign from the town. We stopped at a gas station and asked where the hell that town was, and they told us it was about 30 minutes from El Paso, and it was obvious we didn't stop and just continued our ride. We didn't understand anything at all, because on our first ride, Oro Grande, the town, was 30 minutes away from Ruidoso, and on our way back, the town was about 30 minutes away from El Paso. To this day, I don't understand what the hell happened to me and my friends, and we haven't talked about it much since. I was once driving in Indiana, between Lake Station and Valparaiso. I think it must have been about 5:15 in the morning. There were a few deer about to cross the road, so I slowed down and stopped in order to let them cross, One of them looked right at me, tilted its head like it was considering something, then stood on its back legs and walked across the road. The rest of the deer followed suit, standing on their hind legs and strutting across the worn asphalt. I was training with my foreman that week, and he just looked at me and asked if I'd seen it too. I didn't answer. I just floored it. Another time I was swimming in Lake Michigan, and I felt something profoundly old. The lake was carved into the earth by utterly enormous glaciers, ancient and implacable, and there was something equally old, equally unyielding about that lake. It regarded me, and I felt nothing but contempt and dismal from it. I swam back to shore, opened my flask, and lay on the warm sand. I must have dozed off, because next thing I knew I was at the water's edge, dressed in a crisp blue suit. I smelled ash and ozone, and even though I didn't look behind me, I knew Chicago was burning. I walked into Lake Michigan, and I woke up just as my head went underwater. I'd been dreaming. I washed my face, took the train home, and tried to forget about it. The most recent one is malicious. When I lived with my parents, I woke up one night and felt someone staring at me. I looked around and saw him, an impossibly tall man with skin as dark as coal, wearing a top hat and staring at me. I felt something shaking and saw my German shepherd lying next to me, shaking and growling at him. He glanced at her, looked directly at me, and smiled a horrifyingly wide smile of crooked, chipped teeth. He reached out, grabbed a small box I'd left on the desk, said something in a language I didn't recognize, and vanished. Immediately my dog started whining and licking my face. I couldn't go back to sleep, but I just thought it was a nightmare. I took Lola on a very long walk until my legs felt like lead and passed out. When I woke up a few hours later, I noticed something. The box was not on my desk. It was not in my room. It was gone, and I haven't seen it since. I can't be certain that the last two really happened. I do have depression, and I'll occasionally have bouts of paranoia and terror. I still don't know what happened to that box, and I really don't care enough to find out. I just know that the world is a much bigger and older place than most people care to acknowledge, and in no way have we conquered it. At most, we have survived it. I lived on this huge old house between the ages of 9 and 13. It was just me and my dad most of the time. A lot of stuff happened in this house, but one of the worst was when I was about 10. I was always too scared to sleep upstairs because it had always freaked me out, and it was pretty loud up there. But one time, my dad finally made me sleep in my room on the 3rd story. I was absolutely terrified, so I decided to read a book until I was sleepy enough to pass out. So I'm sitting there with my lamp on reading a book, and out of the corner of my eye I see this huge tarantula crawling up my bedsheets, so I freak out and threw my blankets off. After shaking them around a bit, I couldn't find anything. So I assumed I'd imagined it, and I lay back on the bed again to read. I was getting a bit sleepy when I saw some slight movement out of the corner of my eye, and I looked up from my book to see a young girl in a white nightdress standing at my door, watching me. I was kind of paralyzed with fear and didn't know what to do, and I thought I'd just cover my face with the book. And then When I looked again, she was gone. After that, it was a year or so before I slept in my room upstairs again. But when I did, I started noticing more and more things. There was a balcony with a locked door, which also had one of those latches that you had to turn and then slide across. It was super old and rusty, and my dad could barely get it open sometimes. But I've lost count of the number of times I've walked upstairs and seen that door wide open, or gone to sleep with it locked, and then being awoken to the sound of it slamming open. The most messed up thing that happened is one summer my dad finally decided to sell the house, but the housing market was trash, so no one would buy it. And we kept having to have open houses where people would come over and the realtor would show them round. We used to go to our neighbor's house across the road and wait for them to finish. Anyway, one day we're at our neighbor's house, just watching, and we suddenly see this young lady run out of the house and sit down with her head in her hands. Her husband runs out afterwards and kind of talks to the realtor a bit, and then they both get in the car and drive off. So obviously once everyone left, we asked the realtor what had happened. Apparently, the couple had been looking around upstairs and wandered into the bathroom, where they'd seen a naked girl with wet hair staring at them in a mirror. This shook me up pretty badly, because now it wasn't just me who had seen stuff. We mentioned this to a few of our neighbors, and they all kind of laughed it off and thought it was funny. But there was one neighbor, this old guy, who had lived in the neighborhood for ages, who was really freaked out and told us the story. Apparently there was a guy who spent years and years building the house for his family, working on it every day until it was finished. The day after everyone was moved in, the guy had a heart attack on the front lawn and passed away. This messed up his family pretty bad, in particular his daughter, who ended up killing herself in the upstairs bathroom. To start, I just want to say that I've never been the type of person that gets caught up in the idea of paranormal activities or ghost stories. To me, even at a young age, those types of stories just seemed completely unbelievable, and I could never take them seriously. With that being said, what I'm about to tell you is something that happened to me a few years ago that pretty much changed all of that. It's not an overly scary story, but I think the simplicity of it is what creeped me out as much as it did. My mom was in the real estate business, which often required her to check out houses on her own before taking customers with her. She would usually just do this on her own, but every once in a while she would take me. Well, this house comes on the market that many other agents apparently say is haunted, and my mum figured she'd take me along. I'll be honest, the house was pretty creepy. It was completely covered in vines. It was an old house, not really a big deal, nor out of the ordinary. We go in and look around the first floor, and for the most part, it seems like most houses she takes me to. Still furnished, and has that smell that a house has when it's been empty for a while. The first thing that struck me as a little bit odd was that they had one of those old-style box TVs, and it was playing some old black and white World War II documentary, and it just made the house seem really old and gloomy. We eventually made our way upstairs to look at the bedrooms. The second floor was set up so that there was one long hallway with 2 or 3 doors staggered down its length. The first room was normal enough, but as we got to the second room, we saw it was completely full of stuffed animals, and not the toys, but a whole room dedicated to real stuffed animals. Even though I thought that was pretty strange, the room was fine besides it. Pretty neat, with nothing out of place. Wanting to get out of the room, we went down the hallway to check out the final bedroom, which again was fine. As we're making our way back downstairs, for some reason we passed the second room. I look back and immediately stop in my tracks, because there was now a chair directly in the center of the room. We were both positive it wasn't there before, since we have literally walked into it just moments ago. But nevertheless, there it was, sitting directly in the middle of the room, like it was meant to be there. Obviously, we got out of the house pretty quickly after seeing that. It was something so simple. But what really got to me was that there was no explanation for it. We were the only two in the house, and neither of us went on our own to check it out without the other. So how the hell does a chair randomly move in arguably the weirdest room in the entire house? I consider myself a pretty logical person, and the fact that I can't think of a single explanation for what happened is why thinking about that house still bothers me so many years later. On a side note, in the few years after we looked at the house, it has sold 5 or 6 times, with almost all the homeowners saying strange things would happen when they were in the house, almost like someone didn't want them living there. To preface this a little, I've never had any encounters in any other room in my house before. My parents live in their semi-detached house and have done for as long as I can remember. My parents, myself, and my 2 older sisters lived there together. It was only a 3-bedroom house, so for a while when I was really young, I would sleep in my parents' room, which was the biggest room, and my sisters separate in the smallest and medium rooms. I remember never being scared of the dark at this time. I wasn't bothered by anything at night. I would have thought this was maybe because I had my parents in there to keep me safe. Cut to a few years later, we all switch rooms. I get the smallest room, and my parents got the medium room, and my sisters now shared the biggest. Again, never bothered about the dark. Walking around at night, going to bed by myself. My sisters start to move out, so my parents have the big room again, and I get the medium room, while the smallest is turned into a nursery for my upcoming little brother. I stayed in this medium bedroom for the rest of my time at home, before I moved out. Just another thing about this room. It had the hatch to the attic in it. I was never allowed up there because it was too small according to my parents, despite me being desperately curious to see what was up there. And my bedroom was directly opposite the stairs. This is just for added information. This is when I found out I have a fear of the dark, or so I thought. For years I was terrified of the dark, right up until I was 17. To me, this seems like a long time to be scared, but I quickly realized it wasn't the dark I was afraid of, just something that was in my room. At night I would be so anxious to go to bed. I wouldn't put my hand at the top of the stair rail because I swore something would touch my hand. My mind would always go to a long-fingered skinny hand that would lie on top of my own. I never saw this happen, only felt something on the back of my hand, and that image would project immediately into my mind. I could never look into my own room, walking up the stairs, for the horrible feeling that something was staring right back but I never saw eyes. I would hate getting up in the middle of the night if I were thirsty or whatever, in fear of this presence. The kind of keep your feet under the blankets or the monster will get you feeling. Again, I've never seen this thing, but whenever I would feel the presence of it near, an image of its long, thin hand or a black mass would appear in my head. It never had a face, always just a dark mass with long arms and hands and a head. Fast forward to me turning 17. I still had this fear of this presence. My health took a turn for the worse, and I ended up in the hospital for a while. I came back and the feeling was different. I felt calmer in my room. The presence was still there, and on a night I could still feel the hand on mine. It was like I understood it wasn't there to hurt me, but it didn't feel like there was much reason for it to be there. I never felt this way about any other room. When I moved out at 21, my last night at my parents', there was a sense of warmth in the room, and the presence was really calm. I felt the need to thank it for being there for me. It was such a strange experience, like a weight had been lifted. My little brother has now moved into the room, and I now feel like I can't enter. The doors to the room are always open in my parents' house, but I will be asked frequently to go get things from various rooms and stuff. But in my previous room / now my little brother's room, there's a presence again. It's almost like it looked after me in that room, and then I left, and now it's attached to my brother. I can almost feel it around him when he's there. It still just stays in that room. It never leaves, and never feels like this anywhere else. I'm not really sure what this is. It never seemed to be a person or human. Has anyone else had an experience like this? I'd love to talk about it and know more. And why was it only attached to that one room? I had a lot of weird paranormal stuff happen to me when I was growing up. When I was little, I lived in a 3-bedroom, 1-story house. Main area included kitchen and a living room with no type of partition between. Just wide open space for any area that wasn't going to a bedroom. As a kid, I used to stay up in the living room and watch cartoons or whatever. Whenever I would be out there alone, and only alone, I'd hear the sounds of pots and pans falling to the ground, and cups falling off the counter. Our pots and pans were neatly nestled in a cabinet, with no opportunity of falling, and cups were never left on the counter. As a kid, I didn't think much about it, but it's creepy as hell to think about now. On top of that, you could hear the sound of chains clanging outside the windows, but the only chains around were the swing set, hundreds of feet from the back porch, and that couldn't possibly be loud enough, even on a windy night. In the same house during the same period, my older brother got repeatedly terrorized at night by this shadow thing that he calls the Sandman. Basically, if the blinds were open in such a way that the porch light casts light into our room at night, he'd see this tall, gangly man in a nightcap creeping across the room in the cartoonish, high-kneed tiptoe. He never ever sleeps with the blinds open. You could chalk it up to having an overactive imagination, but it was a creepy house in all honesty. Then when I was in middle school, I went to dog sit with my brother for my mum's friend, who had a huge house in the boonies. It was absolutely massive. But when she gave us a quick tour of the house and where to find the dog food and stuff, she refused to show us the upstairs portion and strictly said that we were under no circumstances allowed upstairs. Whatever, we didn't really care. A few nights into our stay, My sister and her friend came over. Since we had a massive property to do outdoor stuff with, we decided to play manhunt when it got dark. My brother drew the short straw and had to search for us. This property had a ridiculously long driveway, so we decided we could just walk to the end and lay down to hide. It worked pretty well, and we could see the whole front part of the property, including my brother running around searching for us. All of a sudden, all of the lights on the second floor of the house flicked on. We immediately decided to call it quits and just huddled together in the living room for the night, feeling creeped out. That night, the dog we were watching went into the foyer as we tried to sleep and just started howling up the stairs. My dad grew up in a house that had some very weird things happening to him and other members of his family back in the late 70s and early 80s. One day, my dad came home from school and said that someone came running up the basement stairs and pounded on the door. He was the only one home that day, so he ran outside and waited for my grandparents to come home. On another occasion, my dad came home and went into the living room to turn on the TV. Once again, home alone. When he went to turn it on, he saw the reflection of a man standing back behind him. When he turned around, no one was there. He said that sometimes his dog would start growling at his bedroom door, off and on, as if someone was standing outside of it. My aunt had a strange experience once with a boyfriend at the time. One day they came home and went to go inside, when they saw a woman that they figured was my grandmother in the front window of the house. As they approached, she walked away. So they waited at the front door for a few minutes, thinking she was about to let them in. When no one came, she let herself in. My grandmother was in the kitchen, and that's when she realized the woman was wearing red, and my grandmother was not. One morning, a freshly made cup of coffee was sitting on the kitchen counter for my grandfather. No one knew how it was made, and my grandmother swears up and down that she never made it. Cabinets would open and shut, toilets would flush. Dad said a figure would stand in his doorway at times. Thinking it was Grandpa, he would say, "Dad?" to which the figure would just walk away. There were so many weird things that happened in that house. I heard the other guy on the beat get dispatched to a well-being check of an elderly lady. After a few minutes, the guy asks for a supervisor. A few minutes later, they dispatch me to the lady's house. I get there, and the supervisor asks me to climb in through an unsecured window at the back of the house, because I am of a smaller stature. I get to the window and tell it's the bedroom. I can hear a loud television in the other room, and I know it's Fox News. I yell out, "Police, does anyone need help?" As I climb through the window, I hear an old raspy voice call, "Here." I run out of the bedroom down the hall to where I heard the voice from. From the living room, I see a lady laying face down in the dining room area. I call out for her. "Mom, did you fall? Are you hurt?" I run to her, but she's not moving. I touch her hand, and it's ice cold. She's dead. She's been dead for a few days. I unlock the door and let the supervisor and other officer in. I tell them I heard a voice, and we need to check the whole house. No one else was in there. I know the TV was on, but I could tell that it was the news, and I heard the voice over it. What the hell did I hear? This story is primarily about my husband, John. When this happened, I was actually on a girls' brewery tour weekend, and I don't come into play until later. To understand the story, You will need to know that our apartment was on the first floor, and our front porch was directly in front of a parking lot. One evening after work, John returned to our apartment to relax and take a shower. We have 2 dogs, George Washington, a hot mess, and Carlton, a Shih Tzu. While he got in the shower, we heard our dogs barking like crazy, but didn't think anything of it. He got on his pajamas and came back out to the living room. When he came out, he noticed that there was a sheetrock sprinkled out over our couch. He was confused, but the dogs seemed okay, and he thought some of the ceiling may have started to fall. It was one of those insanely attractive popcorn ceilings after all. Then, he turned to face our external wall, which faced the parking lot, and he noticed a hole. It looked like a bullet hole, but he couldn't be sure. He thought about calling the cops, but didn't, and went to bed with no more problems. Fast forward to the next day. John calls me and tells me about the experience. I start to freak, and I rushed home to check on him, my doggos, and the mysterious hole in my wall. And upon returning, I knew 100% it was a bullet hole, and found its trajectory where it made impact further into the apartment. I went out to the parking lot to look for a shell casing, and sure enough, I found one belonging to a 9mm. There was a strong breeze blowing that day, and I didn't want it to blow away or for another car to run it over. So I called the cops and grabbed a plastic bag to put it in. The cops came in and filed a report, and forensics came out with their steel rods and whatnot. They weren't ever actually able to find the bullet though. We had some pretty shaggy carpet, so it may have gotten lost in that and vacuumed up later. I talked to some of the neighbors to try and figure out who the hell would shoot in our apartment. My husband and I are fairly boring people, and we certainly don't love risky lifestyles. After discussing the shooting with multiple people, I came to 2 conclusions. Apparently, drug dealers used to live in our apartment. Someone could have been coming back to handle old business. And earlier during the day when John was at work, our neighbor was in a scuffle with someone in the parking lot, and apparently a shot was fired into the air. Cops were called and came out, but everyone had scattered and nothing came of it. After talking with the neighbors and a cop, it seems most likely that whoever got into a scuffle with my neighbor earlier came back and mistakenly shot into our apartment as a warning or revenge. If that was the case, those morons shot the wrong apartment. What really disturbs me is what the forensic guy told us. If someone had been sitting on the end of our couch, which we both did frequently, because our dogs are couch hogs, we would have definitely been shot. After this, we both said screw apartments and bought a house. Aside from a car break-in, as there are multiple around the neighborhoods, things are fairly uneventful. However, all of these uncanny occurrences caused us to 1. Get a home security system, and 2. Stay strapped. So to the bad-aiming idiot who shot the wrong house, let's not meet. And if we do meet by any chance, I'm ready for you this time. I was in middle school at the time, either 6th or 7th grade, and it was around about 2005. I grew up in a wooded suburb in New England, where the houses were about 100 feet apart and dense forest was usually in between the properties. The neighborhood families with children close to my age had a Halloween tradition called booing, where during the month of October, a family would make a Halloween-themed gift basket full of candy and small toys, and would leave said gift basket on the front stop of a friend's house. ring the doorbell, and run off. Ding dong ditching with a prize. The rule was that once you got booed, you had to keep the tradition going by booing a different family. Great tradition, lots of fun. I'm glad I participated in it. My family was booed, so it was our turn to do it to someone else. The night that I was going to boo my neighbor, a friend, I had a buddy of mine come along just for shits and giggles. We get the gift packet on my friend's stoop, ring the doorbell, and book it into the woods where we hide and watch the door. Everything goes fine. The friend I booed had no clue who it was, and was excited for the gift. My friend and I, who were hiding in the woods, were like, damn, that was a lot of fun. I wish we could do more. We were all out to get gifts, but being young, dumb teenagers, we decided to ring my other neighbor's doorbell and just run away without leaving anything. Now, this neighbor's house was an older family where their children had moved out, but their parents were nice enough, and I'm sure they really wouldn't have cared. My friend was too scared to come to the door, so he hid in the bush while I sneaked up to the house and rang the doorbell. I approached the door and rang the buzzer, and then sprinted back to the bush where my friend was hiding, only to find that he had completely bailed now, and it was just myself. To my surprise, my adult neighbor didn't answer the door, but instead, a group of much older kids, early to mid-20s, came out, looked around, and just laughed. Rather than go back inside, they just hang out in the front yard laughing, acting all sorts of messed up, smoking cigs and stuff. I tried to wait it out, but after 30 minutes had gone by, they showed no signs of leaving. I couldn't help but notice they had this very strange and aggressive behavior, and I was beginning to get nervous. Enough time passes, and I eventually am so freaked out, I decide to just sprint up to their driveway and head straight back to my house. Two of the dudes in the group notice me, and begin shouting threats at me while I ran up the driveway. One of them begins chasing me, while another gets into the car. Luckily, he had to do a 3-point turn to come after me. As I'm running up the driveway, the first guy is chasing me, but I was very fast for my age, and he was unable to catch me. I exit the driveway, and immediately run far down enough the road to reach my property, where I hid out in the forest. The second I get concealed, the car from my neighbor's house comes peeling out the driveway and speeds down the road in my direction. They never find me, but they do many laps around the neighborhood where I can hear them trying to scare me out of hiding. I eventually trudge my way through the forest to my home, where I find my friend and my parents, and I tell them what happened. I didn't know this at the time, but this is where it gets creepy. Apparently my neighbor's daughter has a serious drug addiction, hung out with a very shady crowd, and was eventually kicked out the house. At the time of this incident, my neighbors were in Poland on vacation, and told my parents to keep an eye on their house. Worried about what I told them, my parents called the police, and officers arrived at my neighbor's house. The officers eventually reported to my parents that my neighbor's daughter had broken into their house, knowing her parents were away, and proceeded to throw a hardcore drug party where they absolutely trashed the place, robbed it for drug money, and eventually made it their drug hangout. One of the guys was so messed up, he killed the family cat, and its blood was tracked throughout the place. Knowing all of this, and what they were capable of, it made my encounter that more creepy. Who knows what they would have done to me if I'd have been caught. So to that group of degenerate losers, let's not meet. I was working in a jail as a detention officer. I had just finished our morning routine of passing single-bladed shaving razors to our medical solitary tank when the control room radios me. The inmates were asking for help because somebody cut themselves. Thinking nothing of it, I casually grab a band-aid and head back to the tank. Once back at the tank, I roll the door and enter the tank. Immediately, the other inmate starts yelling that Mark was losing his shit and to help him. I rush to his cell, which is number 10 of 10 in the tank, and it was at the very end, and across from number 5. I get to his cell, which the door had bars across it running vertically, which you can nearly fit your entire arm through. Now Mark is facing his mirror over the sink, repeatedly pronouncing, "I gotta cut this bitch's name off my neck." To add, he is also holding the single blade from the razor which he broke open. I'm trying to get his attention by saying his name. I had a good rapport with him, so I was hoping it would come in handy. Unluckily for myself though, it did. Mark turns around, blade in hand, makes eye contact with me, and in a single fluid motion, he slices himself from the left ear down to the middle of his throat, all while stating, "I gotta get this name off my neck." Due to the location of the cut, and having nicked his carotid artery, I got hit across the face with arterial spray, which then proceeded to spray all over the walls of his cell as well. After being in shock for a moment as to what happened, I regained my sense and called for backup and called for an ambulance for suicide attempt, even though I fully believe he just wanted his ex's name off his neck. To short it up, now my help arrives. We wrestle Mark to the ground and remove the blade from his grasp and apply pressure to his neck while waiting for the paramedics to get there. Mark gets sent to the North Texas State Hospital of Vernon for the criminally insane, arrives back to jail a few weeks later, and attempts to do the same thing 2 more times. Still has his life, lucky enough for him. A few weeks after, when Mark finally got back on his meds and things were under control, he called me back to his new cell. This time it was to apologize for getting blood on me and to thank me for saving his life. He also wanted to let me know that on a personal level, that he had hepatitis C. He said he was honestly worried that he'd ruined the man's life who'd saved him. I'd already gotten tested, and thankfully, I'm hepatitis C free. But I deeply appreciated the concern that he showed at that point. For him to say that, I really must have meant something. I live in the UK, and we got a call to say a guy had been arrested in the early hours for going equipped for theft, and his mother had been into the station to ask about the kids. What kids? He didn't mention kids. I go to the house and shout through the letterbox with no reply. I shout again, and there's a 3-year-old kid that comes to the door. He doesn't have a key, and I ask if he's alone. He says no, that his 18-month-old brother is there with him. 3-year-old and 18-month-old kids alone in a house virtually at night. We use the big red magic key to break down the door and get inside. And oh my god, I'm still haunted by the squalor these kids lived in. Dirty diapers everywhere, takeaway cartons, dirty clothes everywhere. 18-month-old has a diaper that's filled so much it's coming up his back. We get the grandmother to come and collect them, and as we do, I'm looking for a cup to get them a drink and a bit of bread for toast as they've not eaten. The cup has mold growing out of it, and there's nothing except tinned beans. We couldn't even get them a drink of water without risking their health. We get a bottle of water from a nearby shop, and we got the kids away and do a sweep of the house. These poor kids shared a single bed. Their bathroom hadn't been cleaned in years. We go into the dad's bedroom, and he's got cannabis growing, set up in a small tent. This could have been set on fire at any point, and these kids would have perished. We get all of that cleared up and bagged as evidence. I go through the house switching off all the electronic appliances and get to his computer, which is still running. I move the mouse to shut it down, and there are pictures of young children, girls, between the ages of 12 to 13. naked. I've never been so disgusted and angry at one man and the way he lived like that, let alone made his kids lived in that environment. He got a lengthy bail date, lost the kids and lost his house. They live with his grandmother now. They're too good for him, really. I am on the police force, and I responded to a semi versus passenger vehicle. I arrived on the scene to a frantic scene. Multiple people are yelling and crying. I try to make sense of things and ask if anyone is injured, and I heard the voice of a parent yelling out. If you've ever heard someone in person yelling for help with fear and panic, you'll never see things the same way again. Medics arrive about the time I show up. They start to treat the lady who obviously has a broken leg. I start to make sense of things and get the driver out of the semi. I ask if he needs medical and he says no. I go to the vehicle to get ID for the lady, who is being combative and not cooperating. I get up to the vehicle where I'm looking for a purse, and I look in the crumpled bit behind the car the lady was in. I see a laptop on the floorboard. From what I can make out, I can also hear the sound of Blue's Clues playing on a video. I moved the laptop, but was not prepared for what I saw next. On the top of the laptop was covered brain matter and blood. An infant was on the floorboard, folded up and mangled. Skull obviously crushed. No car seat. Baby was around 2 years old. Placed in the back seat with a laptop on their lap. The force from being hit from behind sent the baby into the driver's seat, and the laptop screen smushed the child's skull. I have 100% written child restraint law citations since then. I work in New York City and live in New Jersey. As I was going on my way to take the bus by Port Authority, I saw a bus that was closer than the usual bus I take. The bus driver was outside bringing people into his car. It had the same shape. It was a street away, and it was parked on a different side of the road. I thought it was odd, but I just wanted to get home. As I get in and sit down, I realize this bus is odd. It didn't have the usual stickers or markings or any lights like the usual buses do, and it's tiny. I realize this bus is fake. Just as I realize this, a guy comes running up the bus saying, "It's fake, it's fake." That's when I knew my hunch was right, and an older woman and I try to get out. But then the supposed bus driver who's still outside barricades the door. He puts his arms over the door and will not let us leave. So I told him to piss off and pushed him. Both the woman and I ran the hell out of there and onto the real bus. So jackass bus driver, let's never meet again. My doorknob was moving on and off all night. I opened the door halfway to make sure it wasn't my brother playing a prank. I saw the doorknob moving on both sides of the door on its own all night. I always had a feeling that something did not like me in that house. I was 13 and living at my mum's. That is, for me, specifically. My mum has had strange experiences at that house that she has either brushed off or attributed to her imagination. She was looking at a picture of her deceased grandpa and said she loved him, and the light switch flipped on. My little brother also witnessed this. My spouse seems to attract ghosts. When we first met, the light switch in the room turned on and off on its own about 3 times. He acted like it was normal and told me not to worry about it. Later, He told me about the thing that follows him around and how it pushed him down the stairs once after he and his friends had taunted it. When he was with his ex, he went to a party that had a psychic lady, and she said that something bad was following him around. He has a lot more weird stories about the thing, and it did make its presence known. I actually did not get a bad feeling from whatever it was, but odd things would definitely happen, especially when we talked about it. One night we were talking about it, and I thought maybe it was all in our heads, and before we could go back down the stairs to the basement, the motion detector and hand soap went off 7 times in a row by itself. We were on the other sides of the room, which had never randomly gone off before or acted up in strange ways. Another night, I got the courage to ask it to leave, nicely, but I didn't get the feeling it was inherently evil. It hasn't bothered him since, but I think it still hangs around at his mum's house since we moved out. The last time I visited his mum's house was when I was followed by his shadow and I went down to the basement, which surprised me because she did not believe in the paranormal. My spouse also has weird predictions/prophetic dreams. He dreamed of me 2 years before we even met, while he was still with his ex-girlfriend. He said he told his ex that he was in a truck, although he didn't have a truck at the time, with a girl, me. That wasn't her, and there were weird distinct bumps and lights on the road, which are specific to my area. I didn't believe him until I met her 3 years later, and she corroborated the story. She was really worried about it before they broke up. He had a dream of us having a baby, but sometimes I'm afraid he's gonna dream of a different girl, and we'll break up just like what happened with his ex. I think we will have a happy ending though. It's been 5 years since we were together, and we're getting married in July. This happened about 3 years ago, but I honestly thought nothing of it, until a friend told me a similar story, and got me quite upset about it. It got me thinking about my own experience, and I realized I may have escaped a dangerous situation out of pure luck and stubbornness. So way back 3 years ago, I had started working at a little food truck type business that sat outside a local Lowe's. I was in college, and the owner was really cool about working around my schedule and letting me do homework on my shift. My mum and I both had jobs, but only one car. Usually our schedules didn't cross too much, so only having one car wasn't that much of a problem. However, that day, our schedules crossed over in a really weird way. Well, my brother and sister-in-law live about 5 minutes down the road from where I work. They are out of town for the weekend, but told me I could stay the night at their place and walk to work the next day. That day was crazy hot, but I was pretty used to the heat because the little shop I worked in could get up to 100 degrees easily. Anyway, the road they lived on didn't have any sidewalks, so I had to just walk through people's front yards so that I wouldn't get hit by cars. I was about halfway to my destination when this fancy-ass white SUV pulled up close to me, and this older guy in his 40s rolled down his window and called out to me, "Hey there, you need a ride?" Having not really been paying attention, I automatically said, "No thank you." I don't know why, but that's always my automatic reaction to when someone catches me off guard with a question. "Are you sure? It's really hot out here, and a young girl like you shouldn't be walking on dangerous roads like this." Somewhere in the back of my mind, an alarm started going off. But I like to think the best of people, so I didn't pay it much attention. "No, it's okay," I said. "I'm just going to the Walmart." The Walmart was actually on the opposite side of the shopping area from my work. I don't know why I lied, but for some reason, I didn't want to tell him where I was actually going. I figured that it would be the end of it, and just continued walking. "It's not a problem," he insisted, keeping pace with me in his car. "Just hop in. It's not out of my way." "No, really, I'm good. I like walking." At this point, the guy started to get frustrated. He scowled at me and said something like, "I'm just trying to be a nice guy." And that's when he noticed more cars behind him and must have realized he was holding up traffic, because he gave me one final scowl, growled, "Whatever," and zoomed off. Now, I don't like to be a suspicious person, but whether this guy was a legitimately harmless person or had something more sinister in mind, I don't know. But nonetheless, pushy guy in the fancy SUV, let's not meet again. I had 2 stalkers. One tracked down where I worked from a discussion we had on IRC, and showed up at my work and browsed the store for an hour before coming up to the counter and asking me a bunch of nonsensical questions. He finally asked me if I knew who he was and said I had no idea, and he said he was a paranoid android from IRC and asked if I wanted to get a coffee after work. I politely declined and he left, but showed up again for the next day and just stood around and talked to me while I worked. He continued doing this for weeks, just showing up and talking to me, while I basically ignored him, and I finally had to say that I had a boyfriend and that he couldn't come in anymore. I didn't want to lie, but it just creeped me out so much. He showed up again a month or so later and asked if I still had a boyfriend, and I told him we got engaged and were moving far, far away. The second stalking was online only, thankfully. It started in the MySpace days and continues to this day. He finds me everywhere I go. I don't have a Facebook account in my real name because of this guy. He doesn't know about this Reddit account, thankfully. It's the only place I can post without worrying. Obsession is a weird thing. This is from 2 years ago. I was 16, dressed in a short but fancy dress with makeup on. I'm clearly not a girl, but in fact, transgender. Quite obviously because I was pre-estrogen. I was waiting for a bus at school when I met him. I never got a name or even something I call him. At the time, I was in year 11 and had off periods in the morning, so it was a later bus. The man was talking to people around him the whole time while smoking. He offered me one before I got on. I really hoped he was going in the other direction, but he gets on my bus and sat next to me. He starts talking to a young couple with a newborn baby. I give them a look, and they start to ignore him as I'd been trying to, and they get off at the hospital, and I moved seats to sit where they were. He moved with me and sat right next to me again. Out of nowhere, he blurts out, "I just got out of prison for manslaughter and drug dealing." My immediate response was to panic internally. He then offered me marijuana and pills, and declined and said I was a soccer player, and they tested me frequently, even though I'm not. I felt an immediate uneasiness when he put his hand on my thigh and rubbed it. I sat there frozen until the bus stopped, and he let go. I ran for my next bus when I noticed he was following me, and got on the same one, and I found myself in the same situation. I noticed for the next few weeks he caught the same bus as me, but kept his distance. He was spotted around my school several times, and even outside my house by my mother. We moved shortly after, and I moved within walking distance of my new school. I still live in constant fear. I wonder if he knows where I live, or if he's still stalking me. One day when I was 18 or so, I started to walk up the steps to my bedroom. At the top of the stairs there was a ledge that my dad's ex had a statue of two fairies fishing. On my way up the stairs, it came flying at my head. I moved out of the way and was like, whoa, what the hell? So I walked back down the steps, picked up the fairies, and put them both back where they belonged. I went to tell my dad about it and went into his bedroom. As I started my story, his laundry basket moved from his side of the bedroom over to the side of the room I was on. I was like, well, good night, Dad, and hid under the covers the rest of the night. My dad doesn't believe in ghosts, but even he cannot explain that one. Another time, I was in my bedroom with my ex, and we were getting ready for bed. My dog was asleep on the bed already, until he all of a sudden started low growling and showing his teeth at my closet. His head was low, his ears were flat, and he growled and followed nothing from the closet all the way around my bed towards the bedroom door. He then followed it from the back door to the closet, hackles up, growling getting heavier. When it got back to the closet, he jumped off the bed and went to the other side of the room. My dog was shaken up, my ex was shaken up, and I was shaken up. To lighten the mood, I said, I'm not afraid of no ghosts, and closed my door. Before I could even turn around, the closet door which I had just closed busted open, and I jumped back onto the bed. My closet door is an accordion-style door, and it's been broken since we moved in. You have to lift it off the tracks at the bottom, and then pull it. I checked to make sure my cat wasn't in there and maybe freaked when I closed the door, but my bedroom door was closed, so unless he could suddenly shift through the doors, he wasn't in my room. We all slept under the covers that night. When my dad's girlfriend passed away, he made a DVD of a bunch of pictures with her family and her friends in them. He had it in the DVD player, but when we were watching TV, the DVD player wasn't on, and the input for the cable box wasn't either. While watching, the power in the house goes out for a split second, and the TV boots back. I thought it was weird because we lose power frequently, and then TV never turns itself back on. I write it off. Then, all of a sudden, the DVD player is on, playing her slideshow. When we watched it with my dad, it had a menu screen you had to interact with to get it to start, but this time it just booted up. I took the disc out, put it away, and unplugged the DVD player. This happened back in 2013, during my year in Australia. For reference, I was 19 and a small girl. I had to take a night bus and train from a smaller town back to Sydney. When I boarded the bus, the lights were on, and I saw that there were very few people. A lady with her daughter in the middle, and a middle-aged man, who was Indian, sitting near the back door. Maybe a few more people in the back. So I took my seat near the very front of the bus. As it was St. Patrick's Day, and I had been day drinking, back in the hostel I dozed off pretty quickly with my head leaning against the window. The lights were turned off, and I was expecting a good 2 hours sleep until the next train station. Wrong. I woke up, I'm guessing about half hour or an hour later, something had touched the back of my arm. I opened my eyes and was pretty confused at first, but then I understood that there was someone in the seat behind me, stroking my arm through the space between the seat and the window. At first I froze for 30 seconds before standing up and turning around. It was the Indian dude from the back of the bus. I gave him a solid WTF look, as he was still trying to grab my hand from in between the two bus seats, like he was trying to get me to sit down so that he could keep harassing me through my sleep. Yeah, good idea. I grabbed my stuff and just went and sat as close to the bus driver as I could. Unfortunately, he didn't follow me. Must have gotten the hint, I guess. When we get to the train station, it was like a half-hour wait, and the guy sat across the room from me and gave me pervy looks the whole time, and I didn't get to sleep off my hangover that night. Okay, so there are a few things which I would like to clarify before we get started. 1. I come from a place that has had, and still has to this day, some serious problems with violence towards women and kidnapping of young women, and is sadly something that happens very often. 2. Although I lived all my life in a decent area, some of the other areas weren't so decent, so I kind of learned how to avoid problems. With this in mind, let's get into the story. So it's been a while since I moved to another country, where I had been feeling safe for the past 2 or 3 years, and my family decided that it was finally time to pay me a visit in my new home. The differences between environments were so great that they were all perplexed and amazed about doing things that would be otherwise considered normal to many, like going out at late hours of the night. During their stay, I suggested we should all go to the city centre, and we did. It was such a lovely thing. The weather was nice, we had dinner at a good restaurant, and took some pictures. But they began to get tired, so we started to make our way home. It wasn't even 11 p.m. yet, but it had been a long day of going around. I was talking to my parents as I led the group back, when I noticed a couple of men coming on the opposite direction, with cell phones up, like they were taking a video. I ignored it and kept moving, thinking that they were just tourists. I got my chills when I noticed that the guys are only 1 block away from when I first saw them, and they were standing just a few meters away from us. These guys had gone back on their steps somehow, and were now very near, and not 5 minutes after, I saw them. They were looking at me intently, and even followed me with their eyes. My first reaction was to ignore them, pretend that I didn't see them as to not alert my family, because it so happened to be that some of my family are quite dramatic, and would just blow things out of proportions. So I carried on, and these guys did too, even trying to walk as closely as possible to be making eye contact with me. I begin to use my father to hide from their view, as he's tall, chubby, and always has the appearance of being a frightening person, but he's pretty chill unless provoked. For a time this worked, and the guys kept their distance, but when we arrived to the metro it got creepier still. One of the guys found his way to sneak around to be one person behind my dad on the electric stairs, and tried to walk past him, even attempting to keep making eye contact. Then I noticed that his hands never left his face, covering his mouth for no reason. The other guy was far behind, but I managed to keep myself out of view, and luckily, whoever that was in front of the guy pushed him backwards. I don't know how, but we managed to lose them in between the crowd, but not before I'd get one last glance at them, saying something to each other and pointing to me with their fingers. I hope to never meet those creeps again. This happened around 5 years ago, in the area I grew up in. Back then, I was up to no good. but I have since turned my life around. At the time, I was one of the very few people that moved large amounts of pain pills in the city. The rest of the people trying to move these pills had them imported from sketchy people from around the world, so you didn't always get what you paid for, and the strength would vary a lot. I managed to get a hold of some real ones from within the country, and still within their original packaging. Word quickly got out, and I wasn't very well liked since I guess I took business from people. This incident happened on a hot summer's day, and I decided to go to the park to relax. Where I lived, there was a main road with apartments on both sides in front of my complex. There was a parking lot, and to the right of it, another set of apartments with trees separating that complex from another. I was walking in the wooded area between the two complexes as a shortcut to get to the park. So I'm just walking, minding my own business, when I begin hearing gunshots. They sound really close, and I hid behind a huge tree. I didn't really know what was going on, but looking around I could see the foliage around me move with each gunshot. In retrospect, I guess it was pretty obvious, but they do say hindsight is 20/20. But anyway, I waited for silence and then peeked behind the tree to see what the hell was going on. I managed to get a quick peek of a guy holding a gun, leaning back into his apartment. Change of plans here. I ended up running back to my block as fast as I could when I then slowed down. Pretty bummed out at this point, as I really wanted to go to the park. Anyway, at this point, I'm not sure where to go. It might have been a good idea, but before I was able to give it much thought, I saw two guys appear behind me. Feeling a bit uneasy, understandable perhaps, I'm keeping my eyes on the guys and just trying to keep walking, as if I knew where I were going. It was weird. They didn't really talk to each other, and then they kind of split up on the walking path, still heading towards me. I knew something wasn't right, and I upped my pace to try and test it out. That's when one of them reached for something in his pocket. I still don't know where the hell to go, but I ended up deciding to go to my childhood friend's apartment, which was on the other end of this area. Oh, and her apartment complex has a code, which she usually kept me up to date on since we'd hang out a lot. Back then, I'm not sure if it's still like this, but the code changed every few months. Anyway, I finally make it to her apartment and punch in the code. Wrong code. I try again, and it's wrong. So now I'm panicking because I can't see these guys anymore and I can't get into this stupid building. I called her phone and she buzzed me in, and I ran up the stairs and explained the situation. We played cards and just hung out until the evening, and she offered to walk me home, but I declined. I just felt it a bit unnecessary to put her at possible risk. I did manage to get home safely, as a couple of weeks before this, two people had picked me up and tried to carry me into their car while I was on my way to collect food. I have a feeling that they're the same people, but I couldn't really see the shooter's face very well, probably from the adrenaline, so I guess I'll never know. I was so close to being robbed, taken, or who knows what. My ex-girlfriend, who was also now my baby mama, and myself were desperately looking for a place to live. This was before she got pregnant. We came across a for rent sign. I called the number, left a message, and an elderly lady called me back. We went to the lady's home and it was a duplex. The house attached to hers being the one she was renting. She did no background checks or anything and immediately accepted us. I called my cousin to have the second room as it was a 2-bedroom, and we moved in a week before him. Day 1. I went to work and she wasn't responding to me all night, so I returned home to find her doing her makeup and saying all of the charger ports are broken in this place and that she can't charge her phone. She mentions that she thinks the place is haunted, and I laugh at her in disbelief. Day 2. She went to work. and I had major sleep paralysis and watched my door partially close itself. I went to sleep and woke up to it being completely closed. I believe her at this point, but we had already moved in, and I warned my cousin, who laughed at us. It took him about a week to come and say, "I believe you, but I'm not scared." We eventually stopped being bothered by the supposed ghost, but any time I mentioned to a friend spending the night, they'd laugh in disbelief, and the ghost would do something, like knock something over in the middle of the night, just to prove itself, and they would become believers. One night, we were all drinking in the living room and kept hearing, "That was easy," in the kitchen, randomly, for about an hour every 10 minutes. We discovered that a "that was easy" button was under the oven that never went off until that particular night. This was about a year after living there. It never hurt anyone, but would occasionally knock something over just to remind us of its existence. Very harmless. We lived there 2 years before being evicted for partying too much. Pretty much anyone at my parties who stayed the night would mention some type of interaction with the spirit. I met a guy online. We spoke for a day or two, but I was at the tail end of my degree, and things were getting to be a lot. So I decided that there would be no dating until I was done. I let the handful of guys that seemed nice know before deleting the dating app, so they would know why I deleted it and wouldn't think I ghosted them. He happened to be online when I sent it, and said I seemed cool, and asked if we could keep in touch. Sure, no worries. I added him on Facebook. Maybe once a week he'll ask how I was. Normal conversation stuff. I'd chat about uni, work, the gym, whatever. And after about perhaps 2 to 3 months, he's like, "Hey, we've been chatting for a bit. Why don't we grab a coffee?" I'm like, "Yeah, sure." He seemed nice enough. I reiterated it would be as friends, and that was fine with him. I was about to head into exams, so we made plans for the 3 weeks' time after I had finished. He started messaging me more and more regularly after making plans, more than once a day, and starts calling it a date, which people call catching up coffee date without it meaning an actual date. But I wanted to make sure that we were still on the same page, so I just said, "Hey, you keep calling it a date. Just to make it clear, we're just catching up as friends." He snapped. He was sending me all sorts of horrible things on Facebook, so I blocked him. I gave him my number when we made plans though, so we started calling and leaving voicemails. It was late, so I put my phone on silent and went to sleep. Next morning, I wake up to 37 missed calls and voicemails between 10 p.m, continuing until 4 a.m, as well as a multitude of horrible texts. Now this was 7 years ago, when you couldn't just block someone on a phone. At first I thought that if I ignored him he would get bored, but after about a week, he wasn't slowing down, with dozens of calls a day. I called my phone company to have him blocked, and they said that you can only block 3 people. Are you sure? I had to jump through all the hoops, and then they turned around and said they couldn't do it, and that I would have to call the police. So I did, and they told me I'd have to call the phone company, but I could make a statement of harassment in case he did something more. 3 weeks later, he's still going strong, but in his texts, he starts saying he's going to force me to go on a date with him. I won't have a choice. Then he begins saying that if I won't come to him, he will come to me, and is telling me my schedule, with where I will be at any given time. which he puts together based on our weekly conversation about normal stuff, threatening to come to me wherever I will be. This meant I had to stop doing my regular activities and pretty much became a hermit. He ended up making a threat to my life. I can't remember what he said word for word, but it was essentially, "Girls like you get what they deserve," or something like that. But clearly, more threateningly, as he said that he would be the one to make it happen. I contacted the police again, and that was enough for an RVO, and I never heard from him again. Oh, and I was 20, but his pictures looked younger, so I didn't realize online. But it turned out this guy was 34, so it wasn't just a dumbass young kid, it was a grown-ass man. I've had many other psychos since this guy, but I'm very grateful phones have since allowed you to block anyone at any time. When I was in first grade, my parents bought a piece of land for dirt cheap. It was in an area of town which was known to be cursed land. A lot of people warned my mum not to buy it, but she couldn't resist the price. They started trying to build a wall along the perimeter by the river that ran alongside it, and each day they would start work again, somehow they'd find the wall torn down, and no one knew why. So one day my mum dragged me to the construction site after school, and I guess I was throwing a tantrum. One of the workers told me to shut up, because the spirits will fixate on me if I made a fuss. Apparently they saw a ball of light roaming around the property, which was said to be a bad spirit. That night, I started throwing up blood. A bucket. I remember holding a bucket. I felt nauseous and confused, but didn't feel like I was sick. My parents rushed me to the ER, and all the nurses and doctors were very confused, because the type of blood that I was throwing up wasn't my blood type. Desperate, my mum called a witch doctor. She looked insane, and I remember her well. She looked like she had stepped out of a cheesy, scary movie. White long hair, wrinkly skin, and looked to be at least 100. She started smudging me with what was probably sage, and was chanting, and the whole thing went on for about an hour. Then suddenly I stopped throwing up, and she started throwing up the blood, almost like she took whatever was happening to me away and putting it into her. I forgot exactly how she got rid of whatever malevolent force that was. I just remember her telling my parents that I had one foot in the spirit world and one in the human. That's why I was so vulnerable to attack, and I'll never forget that. That memory remains with me today. I cannot shake it off. Until now, that piece of land remains empty, and I'm glad my parents were able to sell it. I'm 31 now, but was a teen when I was walking home one sunny day. It was winter, but winter in Florida is just a nice cool breeze. I remember holding a Tupperware in my hand that is still hot, containing pasta and broccoli that my grandma had just made. It was so cool living one block away from my grandma, because a quick 10-minute walk meant I got some really good leftovers. In between my house and her house was a patch of woods, but thorns and thickets prevented me from taking a shortcut through them. I remember looking down at the sidewalk just as I reached the middle of the patch of woods to my right. I heard someone ask, "Hey, where are you going?" I looked up, and to my left towards the road, a thin man in a white van with his window rolled down smiled at me. He was driving in the opposite direction of the way I was walking. I simply said, "Home," and continued to walk. He started to say, "Hey, hey," So I look back to see him hanging out of his driver window. "I'll give you a ride home. Come here," he says. I kept walking and loudly say, "No thanks." I stopped and turned around when I heard him drive away. I began walking again, creeped out, wishing that the woods didn't run long next to the sidewalk. I remember wishing I were home already. I was super alert, now hearing every critter in the brush to my right, the rustling leaves and stuff scurrying about. I pick up the pace, reminding myself that those woods were packed with lizards. I said to myself out loud, "It's just lizards running around, silly." But when I hear a vehicle coming up behind me, out of fear I look back, and to my horror, it's the same white van with the man smiling. The van slows down next to me, and a big, angry-looking man flung open the side door and jumped out. I turned to my right and began running as fast as I could into the woods. I was jumping over bushes and long vines, clenching my grandma's Tupperware for dear life. I looked back once, and the thick brush of the woods was slowing down the big man. I knew just going straight I would reach my backyard, guarded by a chain-link fence. I remember the thorns and sticks slicing my skin, but I couldn't feel the pain. I just kept thinking, run. Once I reached the fence, I chucked the Tupperware and hoisted myself over, ripping my jeans and face-planted the ground on the other side with a loud thud. I ran onto my porch and began banging the back door. My dad let me in, and I'm literally panicking, covered in dirt and cuts, trying to lock the back door. I felt safe to be back home with my dad and our Rottweilers. He sat me down and started questioning me, and immediately called the cops. The 2 cops arrived and took a report, and they said, "Nothing like that's ever happened in my area before," and one of them even told me that lying was against the law. I remember they left, and my dad swore he believed me, and I could sleep in his room that night if I wanted. I remember feeling really sad and frustrated about not being believed and going to his bed without even eating the pasta with broccoli. It was hard to sleep or go anywhere for months after that, because I was scared the men were still out there. My dad ended getting me a cell phone and installing an alarm system to help me feel safe. I still have issues being alone to this day. To the men that tried to get me, let's never meet again. This happened last year. Where I used to work, me and my friend would always go to Denny's on Friday and get a milkshake to celebrate the beginning of the weekend. We leave work in separate cars, as we go our separate ways after our milkshakes. I pull in first to the parking lot, and my friend follows. We park on the side of the building, and there's a guy somewhere between the ages of 20 to 35. He was wearing a Chicago Bears beanie hat, and he was just standing there, seeming to be just loitering, just watching the cars go by, smoking a cigarette. I thought nothing of it, as maybe he was waiting for someone, or was just about to leave. Anyway, me and my friend go in and have our milkshakes. Fast forward 20 minutes, and we wrap up and leave. We both smoke a cigarette in the parking lot, and we go back into our own cars and leave. I get home 20 minutes later, because that's how far away I live from Denny's. I wake up about half hour later, so 1 a.m, and my dogs are barking like crazy while jumping up by the front window of my house, the window that faces the driveway. I look out the window, and the trunk of my car is open. So I go outside to further investigate what the hell is going on. There in the snow are footprints, and a red Chicago Bears beanie. My dash and fuse box panel under the steering wheel were all open, and some wires were cut. There was also a metal shim stuck in the ignition. I call the cops, and they fill out a report. They say that it looked like someone tried stealing my car by hot-wiring it. The random guy from Denny's managed to ride 20 minutes home with me in the back of my car without me ever even knowing he was riding with me. And then he proceeded to try and steal my car. I'm not sure if they ever found the guy. 4 years ago, I met this girl called Carrie. We actually met online, and we had a mutual friend called Fred. I used to live with an abusive family, so I had to run away to live with Fred, and I happened to have a crush on Fred. And then I discovered that Carrie happens to have a crush on him too. All three of us were talking normally, until Carrie introduced us to her psychiatrist, Enzo. Whenever we used to talk to her, she was always depressed and wanted to kill herself, and Enzo diagnosed her with schizophrenia, or schizoaffective disorder. Like once she wanted to throw herself from the window, or the time she went insane and hysterically crying, and Enzo had to tranquilize her. There is always something wrong with her, and because we were her family, we wanted to help her, and she also told us about her breast cancer that happened because of her depression. One of the moments she wanted to kill herself is when she was hospitalized for her heart condition. Something happened, and then we hear from Enzo, who was visiting her at the time, that she actually jumped from the 3rd floor of the hospital. She'd broken ribs and a twisted shoulder, and was discharged 4 or 5 days later, without getting admitted to a psychiatric for her suicide attempt. Actually, a lot of times we hear from Enzo that he's going to admit her from a psychiatric hospital, but he didn't. A few months later, she stabbed herself because I told her to improve or else she is no longer my friend. She tells me that she can't, and I tell her that it was nice knowing her, and then we get a message from Enzo that Carrie actually stabbed herself and that she is rushed to the hospital because she lost a lot of blood. She needed a blood transfusion, and Enzo was her donor because there wasn't enough blood in the blood bank. After 2 days, she was discharged, again without getting admitted to psychiatric care. A few weeks after the incident, we told us to show her her scar. She refused and said that there weren't any. Every time when we went to speak to her, we had to be very careful on what to say, or else she'll go nuts, especially regarding her hallucinations. The thing is, we didn't discover this for almost a year, that Enzo was actually Carrie the entire time. She didn't jump from the hospital window, nor had she stabbed herself. She never even had breast cancer, and never had schizophrenia either. And what was her excuse? I just wanted to express myself through Enzo that I couldn't as Carrie. We caught her when Enzo actually told us that he wanted to kill her, and that Carrie was his lab rat, and that he was done with her. We seriously found that so fishy, so we googled his full name and found nothing. We even went to ask people from the same country she lived in about the list of psychiatrists there, and we found nothing. And she also went on to create at least 5 to 6 more other people. She went back to tell her friends about us, ditching her for catfishing. Her friends went to attack us, and apparently she slept with Fred and got pregnant, even though she told him that she was on birth control. Then she had to abort it, and now her friends are blaming her for making her abort it. They also went on attacking me, calling me a goat because I carry an Arab nationality, and they even threatened to tell my family about my whereabouts, and I also got attacked for lying about my age. That's what jealousy does to people, to the point where they catfish and manipulate others. I worked as a crime reporter in the New York City area circa 2010. I had a few very memorable nights. First night out, a guy had committed suicide by jumping off a 30-ish story building. Landed headfirst near a playground, luckily at night, and it was a mess. I teamed up with a local newspaper guy, as I was TV, to collect facts. I was full of adrenaline, running around like crazy. The newspaper guy was a veteran of this, and after 20 or so minutes he came back and said he left a note. He was depressed about losing his custody of his kids. He was just a waiter though, nobody important. I can't blame the other reporter in hindsight. You've got to be callous to do the job. And I quit less than a year later. Another thing I witnessed was suicide by the subway. The body was in separate pieces and was taken out in 3 bags. There was a woman who was burned to death in her apartment. Her upper torso literally looked like charred barbecue chicken. She was alive. They wheeled her out. The sound she made struggling to breathe was terrible. To end on a positive note though, I responded to a shooting outside of a barbershop. Tons of cops and a few detectives. We, as in the newspaper guy and I, get our shots. Shell casings, emergency vehicles, street signs, the works. And then a civilian comes up to us and says, "Hey, there are a few drops of blood on the sidewalk over there." I tell a patrolman and point out the spot. In no uncertain terms, he calls me an idiot for showing him a ketchup splotch on the sidewalk. My partner and I follow the splotch, which keeps getting larger and larger, and begins to grow into a boot print, which leads us to a multi-story tenant building. The elevator floor is covered with blood, and the elevator is out of order. It's a hot day, so my partner and I look at each other and resign ourselves to hauling ass up the stairs. We hit the 3rd floor, and the air reeks of pennies. Outside an apartment door, there's a towel, a boot, and a ton of blood. Just as we get there, a patrolman starts jogging down the hall towards us to kick us out. We had just beaten the NYPD to the scene. We got our shots and left. Turns out the guy had been shot in the leg. Rather than wait around for someone to try a second time, he hopped his ass to a family member's house, wrapped the wound, and called himself an ambulance. He was laid up in hospital, but came out fine. This happened about 7 or 8 years ago, when I was still in high school, being 16 or 17 years old. My friend and I would go to the mall after school on Fridays every once in a while. Neither of us could drive yet, so we would have to take the bus there and back. We would part ways at the transit center and take different buses home. I would be alone on the bus around 9 to 10, and it was pretty dark out by then. I would have a bunch of shopping bags, and my stop was one of the last ones, so there wouldn't be many people on there by the time I got off. Every time I was on my way home, I would always see this man staring at me, and he would give me a creepy smile. So I would try to get up really last minute to see if he would get off, and he would always wait for me to get off before he did. Then he would purposefully walk by me and smile creepily and wave at me, and I would just nervously say hi back and quickly walk or run to my house, since it was only about a minute away. One of the last times I saw him, I was really scared and went to the front of the bus when it was time to get off at my stop. There were 2 doors to get off the bus, one near the front besides the bus driver, and another near the back. I was more shy back then and was scared to speak up, so I kind of just lingered around the bus driver and didn't tell him what was going on. The bus driver just thought that I wasn't getting off, so he was about to drive off, but then at the last minute, I told him this was my stop. The bus driver was confused but let me go, and the creepy man proceeded to get off as well, which means he was lingering around seeing if I would get off at my usual stop. This time when he walked by me, He had a smirk on his face and seemed like he knew he was scaring me and was getting a kick out of frightening me. I never saw him again, and I no longer take that bus. I am a 25-year-old Latino male. I live in a large city and am married and have 2 kids. But that's besides the point. It has nothing to do with them. Onto the story. It's really bizarre. I work at a 10-floor building as an armed guard for solely the interior part of the building. I only stay inside because we have other guards at the main entrance that check people in, so I only monitor cameras and conduct patrols whenever I want to by the hour. It's really boring most of the time, which brings me to Reddit, lurking. Anyway, some of the floors in the building are occasionally blocked off for renovations. The floor is either completely demolished, or if it's being completely empty, means that it's my favorite places to go while I'm patrolling. Because no one's allowed to be on those floors except security, contractors, renovations, or the janitors. I leave to do my usual patrols, but before I decide that I need to go to the bathroom. But when I do, the men's room is completely full. So I have my most bright idea. Hey, that floor with the renovations will be completely empty. And because no one gets to go there, it'll be spotless. I think I'll hurry to complete my patrol and get to the restroom. Except it's not empty. I don't find it to be extremely odd, as it's about 10 AM and the elevators still go to this floor. I just think somebody has the same idea I had. So I go to the stall furthest away from this guy and try to do my business. Without trying to gross everyone out, I'm gonna tell you this story like it happened. I dropped my pants and I'm handling business. And as soon as I do, this guy is whispering shit all creepy like. Not completely weird at first, but then it just gets louder and louder. And I hear words like, him, over there, they, and you. I think the dude is trying to get my attention, so I'm sitting here, eyes wide open, glad that I'm already on the John. Still, this guy's whispering stuff like he's possessed. I can't even comfortably use the restroom because this guy's freaking me out. So then I realized something, that from the moment I got in here, until the point, which is about 10 minutes give or take a couple, I don't think I once heard anything giving the impression that this dude is even using the bathroom. So everything told me in my instincts not to look, but I do anyway, towards his feet. And this guy is not even on the bathroom. He's standing straight up whispering. So I completely irrationally noped out of there so that I could radio my entrance guard to inform him of what was going on. I posted myself in the hallway waiting for this guy to come out. 30 minutes passed, and I'd had enough of this. I walked in twice, acting if I was going to wash my hands, and the third time, I'd had enough. So I knock on his stall and say, "Security, is everything all good in there?" A completely normal voice responds, Yeah, I'm fine." I wait about 2 to 3 more minutes, and this dude finally comes out. He asks if someone reported him. I told him no, and that I was using the restroom and he was exhibiting strange behavior, and that he was there for a really long time. He says it was nothing, and I ask for his work badge and get his name and company, and explain that he's not allowed to be on this floor. He says he understands, and that it won't happen again, with a look in his face like I scared him. I really hope not to see him again. There was a brief period of time where me and my younger sister shared a room with bunk beds. This isn't overly important, though it does kind of come into play later. I'd say it was about 11 p.m. and we were just on our phones and stuff on social media, YouTube and everything. And I always thought my house was haunted. I've had quite a few experiences in it, you see, but this pretty much confirmed it. So we were lying there, and all of a sudden, we heard really loud static. It sounded like a record/vinyl player that's not playing correctly. Really weird and distorted almost. Now my dad does have a record player, but it's not been used in years, and is under a pile of books and clothes. It's also in his room, which is at the other end of the upstairs hallway, and this static sound seemed to be coming from the room that we were in. It was that loud. This is the part that seems fake, and I totally understand if you think it is. We heard a really deep, guttural male laugh that also seemed to be coming from within the room. We were the only two people there. Again, a possible explanation could be that my dad was laughing. However, he was downstairs at this point, as both my parents like movies, and most nights will watch one and go to bed relatively late. And this laugh was much deeper than I've ever known his to be. It creeped me out. Safe to say I didn't sleep that night. Also, this may have nothing to do with that, but I'll mention it anyway. Since this incident, me and my sister's memories of it have changed, but only minorly. Such as I remember being on the top bunk and her being on the bottom, whereas she swears she was at the top and I was at the bottom. This was about 2 years ago now, and obviously forgetting is easy as hell, but it weirds me out big time. My sister more or less now leaves that room, even if I bring it up. Given that I moved into my own room shortly after this happened, and the room it happened in is now her own. My family swears up and down that this didn't happen, but I swear to God, I know what I saw. My house is 1 story, and we only have 2 bathrooms, one down the hall and the other in my parents' room. I hate my parents' room in general. It just gives me a bad feeling overall, and I had my first case of sleep paralysis in that room. For whatever reason, my bathroom shower was broken, so I went into my parents' room to shower. I told them both I was there, so my dad wouldn't have to worry about accidentally walking in on me, and my mother helped run the shower for me. She kissed me goodbye, and I began to undress. After I had my shirt off, bare chest, and all out, I tried to get a Bluetooth speaker to sync with my phone, but it just wasn't having it. In the middle of my struggle, the doorknob started shaking. It was locked, so the only way to move it was from left to right, and it just kept on shaking loudly. I turned around and screamed, "Yeah?" and got no reply. I said it again, but there was still nothing. The doorknob just kept on shaking. Eventually it stopped and went quiet again, and I just ended up taking my shower. But the entire time, I couldn't take my eyes off the door. Now, as an artist/writer, I couldn't help but to imagine scary scenarios that really would just make me pass out. I figured someone cracking open the door, but just enough to look at me before closing it again unannounced. Eventually I was really freaked out, and I cut the shower short. After quickly putting on a towel, I stood in front of the door and thought to myself, I remember leaving the lights on in my parents' room, so if they're off, I'm going to die. Lo and behold, the lights in my parents' room were off, and the switch was next to the door. So I just took a deep breath and booked it across the dark room in nothing but a towel. After I put on a bathrobe, I confronted my mother and asked if she'd turned off the lights. My mum regularly forgets to leave the lights on for anyone else in a room, so it made sense that she did that after my shower. She turned the lights off on her way out, I'd imagine. But when I asked her about the doorknob, she told me instantly to stop lying. Now I'm standing there like, you're kidding me, right? Did you shake the doorknob or what? My mum says no, and that no one did. My dad had been asleep on the couch the entire time, and she hadn't seen my brother come in. Now I'm thinking, okay, it's my little brother, the absolute prick. I like to shake the bathroom doorknob once or twice when he's inside to scare him, so he must have pranked me too. Nope. He was inside his room mid-game tournament with his door locked. After his game, I asked him and he told me it wasn't. He was inside gaming, even raging, so he definitely wasn't in the mood to mess with me. He really didn't. And he's kind of scared of the dark as well, so I doubt he would have walked into the dark room just to shake the doorknob for 2 minutes. My family agree. I imagined it. And even though I have an active imagination, I never actually see anything. My mum in her life has had ghost stories about shaking doorknobs that have no explanation. I'm certain it wasn't my family, and something like the wind couldn't have done it either. Not when all the windows are closed, mind you. Not even a pet was in the room. So what could it have been? My family is just your average Pennsylvanian family. We like to go to the lake and camp on weekends in the summer months. Usually, the lake is uneventful. My family camps in a campground, so when we get up, we go for breakfast. This town is full of old weirdos, meth heads, and drugs. The people always stare at us, and it still happens today. This place that we eat at is very small, and you go up to register to order. Anyway, we went to the restaurant to eat when I was 7. The drive-in was normal as usual, and my parents were getting gas, and I had no clue where my brother went. So I went into the restaurant by myself, which was a horrible mistake. When I went into the restaurant alone, an employee saw me and called me over. The man at the counter had black curly hair with no facial hair, and he looked pretty young to me. He said that his car doors opened up like a Lamborghini. Now, looking back on this, it was probably one of the stupidest things to say to a 7-year-old. He asked me if I wanted to see his car. By this, I was kind of weirded out by this guy, and didn't want anything to do with him. But I feared being rude, so I went with him. His car was blue and had a white stripe down the middle. "Go see it," he said, and I started to get nervous. But I obeyed anyway and went to the car, and he followed me. I was right by his car when I heard my mother screaming, "Bryce, get over here now!" So I ran to her. She looked pretty pissed, and she was, and she lectured me about not to go with strangers. But my 7-year-old self wasn't paying attention. We still ate at the restaurant, and we had another woman take our order, but for some reason I never saw the man again. At the moment, my 7-year-old self hadn't understood why that guy approached me. But just a few weeks ago, I remembered this story, and got very emotional. That guy could have literally taken me away, or killed me. And just like that, I could have been gone, never to have been seen again. Kidnapping is something everyone fears in the back of their heads. For some reason, though, I got lucky. Keep an eye on your young children. You never know when or where something could happen. They could be on your side 1 second, and the next they could wander off, never to be seen again. Not everyone in this world is nice and caring, and it can happen to anyone at any time. When I was in first grade, I rode the bus to and from school every day. There was a teenage boy from high school who rode the bus too. One day he asked me to sit with him and told me that he was asked to ride the school bus to help the bus driver keep the children orderly. I remember that he always wore a cowboy hat. Other than that, there were only young grade schoolers who rode the bus. He started asking me to sit with him every morning. He would bring me candy and give me quarters for the snack machine at school. He always told me how pretty I was, and how much smarter than the other girls my age I was as well. He would show me his paintings. They were always of beautiful women and mermaids, but they were always topless or nude. I thought that I was very grown up, because I got to see his racy art. This went on until Thanksgiving break that year. During Thanksgiving break, I went to visit a friend and had the best time. I remember having my mind blown because her mum had a laminating machine and laminated our drawings so that we could keep them forever. I got back home and thought everything was normal until Thanksgiving Day. Over Thanksgiving dinner, my mum angrily mentioned that I had a friend stop by while I was gone to my little girl's friend's house. Somehow, I don't know, I knew that it was the guy in the cowboy hat. The angry way she said it made me confused and ashamed, and I felt so awful that I couldn't finish my Thanksgiving dinner. Years later, I was speaking with my sister, remembering that day, and she told me something I never knew. The day I went to my little friend's house, the guy in the cowboy's hat came to my house in his car. He of course knew where I lived because he saw me get on the bus every morning. He knocked on the door, and my aunt who was babysitting answered. He asked for me by name, and when she asked me what he needed me for, he said he wanted me to take me on a date. My aunt was so angry, she chased him to his car and down the street, hollering that she'd kill him if he ever came back. Come to think of it, I never saw him on the bus again after that Thanksgiving break. So, guy in the cowboy hat that wanted to take a first grader on a date, let's not meet again. I'm not usually one that believes in the paranormal, but this made me question everything. My girlfriend has always told me that her house was haunted. I'd always hear creaks and stuff upstairs, and the occasional footstep, but I always played it off as normal house noises, until one night of August this year. We were downstairs watching TV like usual, about to go to bed, when we both got a very weird feeling almost simultaneously. She gave me a weird look, and I didn't think anything of it, so we went to bed. After a few minutes of her on Twitter and me on Reddit, we put our phones down and rolled over to go to sleep. Then we both heard the words, "Good night," in a child's voice. Doesn't it seem strange? Well, considering there weren't children in the house, we both looked at each other. Why would you say goodnight like that? Then we realized neither of us had said it, and we left her room fairly quickly. We went downstairs to lay on the couch and watch a little TV and come to our senses, and try to figure out where those words might have come from. Then, we both got that feeling like someone was watching us. Not like, oh, that dude over there's been staring at me, but a something will not take their eyes off me no matter what I do kind of feeling. So we decided it was best to leave the house. We went to walk out the front door, but right as we were about to open it, we heard the child's voice again. This time it came from the balcony right above us in the entryway. Clear as day, a child said, "Mummy, Daddy." We looked at each other. I may or may not have screamed, and we ran to my car and decided to drive to the one place that was open in our shitty small Oregon town, Walmart. The problem was, as soon as we got in the car, we knew something had come with us, and it was pissed for leaving. The second we got into my Honda, there was nothing but the feeling of hate instilled into both of us for no reason whatsoever. Whatever it was filled that car with hate. It's now about 4 a.m. and I have to be at work in 5 hours, so we decide to go back to her house and to try and get some sleep and see what happens. We walk into the front door and nothing. It's quiet. We walk up the stairs, turn right, and suddenly it sounds like a dog is growling from her upstairs bathroom. It takes me a second though, because I grew up with dogs, and all I could think about was that it was mine, just being weird. 5 seconds later, I realize I'm at her house, and no dog of mine, or any others for that matter, has ever set paw in there. Something was growling, and we didn't know what it was. At this point, I'm pissed at whatever is happening because I'm tired and need to sleep for work. So I come up with this brilliant plan to talk shit to whatever it was causing these issues. The only thing that sticks out at this point is me yelling, "If you're so pissed, do something about it." Right after that, I feel something tug at my shirt. I turn around thinking it's my girlfriend playing a very unfunny joke on me, but she was still downstairs. Something pulled my shirt. After that, I decided it was time to leave for the night. At 6 a.m. we get in the car and drive to my mum's house. That car ride was much less hate-filled, and all the bad feelings were gone for a while. I went to work while my girlfriend slept at my mum's place, and when I got off, we went back to her house to check everything. It all seemed fine, except for the one picture of us she had hanging on her wall was knocked to the ground, like something out of a horror movie. But she was too exhausted to care about my safety at that point, and I was so tired, I was willing to let whatever was there kill us, just so that I could get some rest. 2 weeks later we moved out, and hadn't had any problems since. I never believed in the paranormal at all until this happened. I still question it. My brain thinks there has to be a logical explanation to it all, and I'm sure there is. But I know she believes, and a piece of me believes that there is something else in that house. My older brother did little police work after he got out of the Marine Corps, and in that about 8-month span, he saw 2 suicides happen in real time with his own eyes. The scarier part is that he took me on a little ride along one time, just before we were about to eat lunch. There was construction on a main road, so we took another road that led through a pretty bad part of town. But the second quickest way back to the main town was the main road being bad. I remember a lot of people staring at us, and just as we were about to hit the road back into town, we heard gunshots ring out. He called it in, sirens on, drove to wherever they were, and this was just about a year ago. I was 16, and I wasn't really scared. I knew how to handle a gun if I needed to. We go there where we thought we heard the shots, and there were some people running. He went to get out. Then all I heard were these gunshots going off that seemed right next to me, and then the crackling of a windshield and bullets hitting the car. My brother got hit once in the chest, but thank God he had his Kevlar on. He exchanged fire and hit the assailant twice, knocking him to the ground. What I didn't know at first was that I got hit in the arm, I only noticed when my arm felt tingly, and I looked down and noticed I was bleeding. I stayed calm as best I could and let my brother do his work, and searched around for a first aid kit. He yelled back at me if I was hit, and I said yes but told him to focus on the assailant. I'm a big military guy, going into the Marine Corps next year. I eventually got my arm bandaged as best I could, and figured out the bullet went all the way through my arm, and it did. Everyone survived. Everyone was okay for the most part, but I'm never doing ride-alongs again. The assailant ended up going to the hospital. He was fine, and I don't remember how many years he got. I've had my Instagram for about 5 years. I post pretty simple photos, ones of me, and I'm a photographer and artist, so a good amount of pictures that I take as well. I don't have a large following on Instagram, so considering this started about 4 years ago, I probably had around 2,000 followers, and most of them were friends, family, or friends of friends. One day I posted a screenshot on my private Instagram of someone randomly viewing my story. I'm not sure what the context was, but it doesn't really matter. Soon after, a friend of mine pointed out that one of the Instagram accounts that was viewing my story had a profile picture that was a photo of my friend, so I immediately went to their account. I noticed that all of their pictures were ones screenshotted from my account, and I immediately began freaking out. They went by a kind of Russianized version of my name and had about 1,000 followers. I was baffled. This account didn't last that long, and was receiving probably more activity than my own. I was confused, but I also knew that that was what happens when you have a public Instagram, and some catfish isn't going to ruin my life, so I reported it and moved on. Soon after, I started getting messages from random Instagram accounts that all seemed to be coming from Russia. They would send me messages and screenshots of different accounts that also all seemed to be in Russian, of people pretending to be me. I started to panic more, and I knew that not only was it not just one person, but that many people knew about it, and genuinely thought that I was a completely different person than I was. I kept reporting these accounts, and they would mysteriously delete and then show up again under new names. But at this point, my Instagram account was blocked by pretty much all of the catfish accounts. I logged into a friend's Instagram and noticed tagged photos of the catfish of me. Drawings, many drawings, people drawing me, who they totally thought was some random Russian girl. There was a Twitter account, a YouTube account, a VK, which is a Russian-based social media account, a Facebook account, all under this fake name and using pictures of me. I finally got a lot of fake accounts to be deleted and felt relieved. Then, probably about 6 months later, I got another message on Instagram for some other random Russian account sending me to yet another fake profile pretending to be from me. The first thing that stuck out to me was the fact that they had a photo of my mum from when I was a baby. A photo that was only available on my mum's Facebook, which was not public. I panicked, reported the account, and told all of my friends to do the same. Then I got curious. I started wondering who these people were, and where they were finding these accounts. I went deep back into my Instagram DMs, and found that these accounts were also now catfishes of me. I don't know what part of me thought that it would be a good idea to message them, but I did, and I ended up having a very long conversation with them. What they told me was that they used the photos of me because I looked like them, and they were very self-conscious. They even said that they show their family photos of me and pretend it's them. One day, I tried to log into my Instagram, and it said something in Russian, that someone had made numerous attempts to reach my password. It was insane. Basically, I'll save the time and effort and say that this went on for another 3 years, happening randomly every 6 months. Finally, there was one account made using my own name. I was so furious and had completely given up, and a few of my friends messaged them and told them to delete the account. They then DM'd me, apologized in broken English, and then decided that they were going to turn their account into a fan page. Again, not super weird. I even got to a point where I was considering calling up the producers of Catfish or something, literally anything. The fan page was running for about 3 months, but it seemed to me that they had deleted it. I still get weird messages from Russian accounts that seem too similar to the others, but I don't feel freaked out by it anymore. This whole situation sucks because I was never directly threatened or put in a situation in which I felt like my life was in danger, so I couldn't go to the police. But there were definitely times when I felt like I was being watched too closely, or for someone who was not famous or anything near it. Not really sure how to end this, because it may never do it, but I hope to never meet you again. A few years ago, I had a scary Pokemon Go encounter. For a bit of backstory on this, I was a vendor for a company that I will not mention. My job was to drive to my set of stores, stock the products, build displays, and other retail things. I loved playing Pokemon Go with my job, since I could encounter more Pokemon in different areas rather than the city I lived in. At this point in the game's history, Mewtwo was newly released, and it was more rare than it is now. For this encounter, I was in a city I rarely did any raids in, because I didn't know anyone who played. I finished my last store for the day and pulled out my phone to see if there were any in the area that I could do. I see a few in the park, drive there, and go there so that I can play one solo. I see a group of kids with their phones out and ask them if they're about to fight the raid boss. They said that they were, and so I joined them. For context, they looked like stereotypical Mexican wannabe gang members. I've raided with various people in the past that have gang background. When I raid, I usually look at the level of the players I play with to see if I need to use my best or I can get away with using a joke team. I assumed with the large group, I could use my joke team and threw in my own Mewtwo. We didn't beat the raid boss in time, sadly, and they get upset with me that I threw in the incorrect Pokemon, and they didn't have one. Because I'm the new guy in town, they know I'm the guy with it, and they start saying things like I did various sexual acts for my Mewtwo in Spanish. I acquired it a legit way, by the way. I'm half Mexican and half white, and I know what they can say. I apologize and explain that I thought we had enough people so I could use my unserious team. It was clear that they were not amused. They were pissed, and I didn't want to cause any more problems. The next thing I know, they're pulling out knives and threatening me. They're making gestures that I perform the sexual acts on them, and after telling them no, they pull out more knives and tell me to never raid with them again or they will kill me. I quickly run to my car and drive home. I tell my local group I play with and they were shocked. In all honesty, I should have called the cops, but I have no idea who they were in order to tell the officers. Seems so silly over just a game, really. My grandma's house has always been a little strange. It's one of those buildings where, although it appears homely and a nice place, there's just something really wrong as soon as you step in. It's kind of like feeling, well, it's difficult to explain. Maybe kind of like the atmosphere is thick and heavy. Anyway, my grandma has lived in this house for a long time, and her mother lived in the house before that. So my grandma was actually born in the house and still lives there, but even she sometimes gets scared. My family, including myself, have all experienced something. I'll start off with my dad's experiences, since he lived there. His room was really small and had no windows and was right within the middle of the house. While he lived there, he used to have a recurring nightmare about this man standing in the dark waiting for him. Then one night, he woke up and the man was actually there. He didn't dare move and just pretended to sleep so that he would have no idea if or when it disappeared. He had various other experiences too, but that was the most significant. My experience I had when I was sat in one of her 2 living rooms with everyone who was at the house. I'm not really into speaking with a lot of people, so I just kind of sat letting my gaze wander off. Then I saw the shadow of someone in the other room, and I thought there was someone there, so I called out to them, but it moved away, and when I looked there was no one there. I have to admit that that one is very easily explained due to how many ornaments and figures my grandma has that could have caused a trick of the light. The next one is much scarier. To get to the bathroom in my grandma's house, you have to walk through one living room, through the kitchen, which is set out like a big corridor, and through a hallway which has a door to the basement stairs. Note, this is always kept locked, and then you reach the bathroom doors. I had just been to the bathroom and was not about to walk back, and when I was halfway through the kitchen, I heard a door creak open, and as I went to look back, it was the door to the basement stairs. Now this door is always kept locked, so you can imagine how surprised I was to see a heavy wooden door that had previously been locked swing open. There was no wind or anything, and all the windows were closed, and even if it was open, it was really old and a heavy door, and took a hell of a lot of force to open. I went back and shut the door, trying not to look down, and left, because I didn't want my grandma to think I was snooping around her house. My grandparents themselves had also had experiences in there. One experience was how she has some little metal balls in a cabinet in one of her living rooms. One day they were both in the other living room when they heard the bells ringing in the other room. They went through thinking that a family member had arrived and was just joking with them or something, but there was nobody there, and the bells were out of the cabinet and on the table. I strongly believe that these are experiences linked with one thing, a Ouija board. When my grandma was younger and lived, like I said, in the same house, she was playing with a Ouija board, and her 6 sisters were too, in the basement. This is as much of the story as I could actually get out of her, because she told us all that she was too scared to tell us the rest, and refused to say. I strongly believe that whatever happened was so bad and so scary that I'll never find out, and perhaps I don't want to. I live in Manchester in the UK. It's an amazing, not too big, arty, musical, and electric city. I myself am a bartender. The bar I work in is gorgeous, as well as loved, but the street it's on is a bit dangerous, as there are a lot of muggings, drugs, and sadly, a few sexual assaults. Although it seems to go through periods of being cleaned up a bit again. Anyway, I mostly work day shifts, and this takes place around 3 years ago. It was about 2 p.m, and it was just me, i.e. a small female, and our small female chef at work. Our general manager had gone off to the bank. We had 2 customers in. A woman enters, and it was instantly clear she was either on something or had mental health issues. We're not allowed to serve people who are too drunk, but having had an instance before where I confused a man with neurological issues as too drunk, I always try to distinguish properly before proceeding. The woman asked for a double brandy, and I realized she wasn't drunk, so I gave her one. She kept saying, "Thank you, miss. You're so beautiful, miss. I love you, miss. I would marry you, miss." And I thanked her and smiled, but was getting slightly scared at this point due to the intensity of the way that she was saying things. She kept complimenting me, and I kept thanking her, but something was off, and she kept leaning forwards like she was trying to grab me, then pulling back and laughing. Then things got pretty scary. She began talking to her hand as if it were a phone, and getting heated, yelling to stop following her and to leave her alone. She did this numerous times, getting more and more angry. Myself and the chef were exchanging glances, and not quite sure how to proceed without escalating the situation. She suddenly turned and looked at me again, and said, "I don't like you anymore, miss. There's a black spider, a big black spider behind you and in your heart. I can see it, and I don't like you anymore. I just got out of prison for murder, and I have a knife, and I'm going to cut that black spider out of you. I'm going to cut your heart out." She was screaming this at me, and repeated that she was going to cut my heart out. And she had a bag, so it was entirely possible that she did have a weapon. Plus, she just told me that she had just got out of prison for murder. There's nothing but the bar and a little step that's keeping her from me, and I just lost it. I began having a full-blown panic attack and cried my eyes out whilst crouching on the floor. I didn't know what else to do. I thought phoning the police would escalate her. It wasn't the smartest nor bravest move, but I was utterly terrified and genuinely thought she was going to kill me. Luckily, my chef, who was a badass Spanish lady, decided to call her bluff and went up to her and said, "You need to leave," while ushering her to the door, and she actually did. I don't know if I'd have done that if she'd have left, since all of her attention/admiration and hatred seemed aimed at me, and no one else seemed to be in view. Anyway, I was incredibly thankful, and the 2 customers rushed over to me and said they worked in social care, and had actually been texting colleagues asking them to send help with the police while she was ranting, as they didn't want to escalate her by obviously phoning the police. They came, took statements, and all was sorted, but I was shaken up for the rest of the day. It all transpired that she lived in a psychiatric residential home full-time, and was schizophrenic amongst other things, and had been on day release with a carer who had lost sight of her in a shopping centre, and she really did have a knife in her bag. I'm not sure if she'd shoplifted it or what, but that sent chills down my spine. As I said, if I had tried to usher her out or called the police, I have no idea if she would have actually stabbed me. She hadn't been in prison or murdered anyone though. Fortunately, it was all in her head. Regardless, I would rather never meet her again. When I was in 8th grade, I went to a charter school, and my sister, who is 6.5 years younger than me, went to the same school. It was kindergarten through to 8th. Now, because it was a charter school, it didn't have school buses, so my mother would always drive us to and from. We have schools nearby that use buses. However, one of these was the Country Early College, which would bus people to a community college in the area. This meant that the buses for the early college would travel much further and even occasionally spend time on highways. This is important for the story. We were on our way to school one morning, and we were just coming over a hill, as we live in the mountains, and I noticed something immediately. The moment I saw what was in front of me, I was already asking my mother, "Is there a school bus going through that building?" She started to tell me no, but then she saw it. The early college bus had gone through the wall of the country store that was across the street from our school. In the parking lot, a parked truck had been crumpled, and in the middle of the street, a car had been struck. I'm never going to forget what I saw that morning, and thank God my sister wasn't looking. I can remember so vividly. The accident must have only happened. No emergency vehicles had arrived, and there was a man in the car. I remember seeing him draped across his steering wheel, arms hanging lifelessly out the window, and I remember the blood. Later on, I learned what happened. The man had been drunk driving at 7 a.m. and had been swerving. The bus driver had attempted to swerve out of the way, but had struck the car anyway and lost control, hitting the parked pickup and going through the building. Luckily, the worst injury on the bus was a case of whiplash. The man, however, was killed on impact. I also learned that it had been his young daughter's birthday. Honestly, the story doesn't even end there, though that was the worst of it. A year later, I was attending the early college, and I was on the bus with several of the students who had been in that first wreck. One morning we were leaving our base high school to the early college, and a car came racing up a narrow road on the wrong side. The driver had two options. He could hit the car or he could swerve, and the bus would go through a house. He chose to hit the car. The passenger side crumpled inwards, and the front bumper came completely off, but the driver of the car and his girlfriend, who had been in the passenger seat, were all right. I think the girlfriend was just bruised up a bit, but that's all. The students on our bus, however, that was another story. I have PTSD from just witnessing the first crash, but many of the others have had to live through it. They had to send all of us home due to the panic that set in. It was horrific. This happened in the mid-afternoon of Saturday, December 22nd, 2007. I know this because I wrote a live journal post about it and looked up the date as I posted it. First, a little background. At the time, I was 42 years old. I'm basically a fat, bald white guy. I was visiting my mother in my hometown in west central Alabama. Very rural, quite small, with about 1,800 people in total. That neighborhood was typical for a small, dying southern town. A bunch of older retired people whose children have since all moved away. My mother had just turned 70 at the time, and that was about a median age of the people in the neighborhood. Her house was on a corner by itself, and behind that was a small forest and then a cow pasture. So her lot was the back edge of the neighborhood. The block across the street from her held about 7 homes, 2 of which faced her house. The yards are big. My mother's was about an acre, and the homes were built in the 60s, and everything is a bit more sprawly than suburban subdivisions. It was 3 days before Christmas, and we were getting ready to go to Tuscaloosa, the closest big city, to attend a family Christmas party thrown by some cousins on my father's side. They'd invited me and my mother, and we were bringing my uncle on my father's side with us. Even though it was late December, this was Alabama, so it wasn't frigid outside by any stretch of the imagination. It was chilly, 40s to 50s, but not cold, at least not to me. I was wearing a thin, grey hoodie. My mother had gone to her parents' house to make sure that they were okay, and I was outside at her house getting my car ready to accommodate 3 people, gifts, and food. I noticed 2 teenage boys in hoodies similar to my own, walking slowly down the street. They didn't even register the first time, just people moving on the street. When they came by the second time, I glanced up to see who they were. It's a tiny town, and everyone knows everyone, but I didn't recognize them. Well, it was Christmas. I just assumed one of the neighbors had family over too. I think I even waved as they approached the second time. Then I locked the car and went inside to take a shower and get ready for the party. I'll note that they were still in front of my mother's house when I went inside. 20 minutes later, I'm dressed and ready, and find my mother watching out the window. The police car, the small town is small enough that it only has 1 officer on duty on weekends, lights flashing, is parked at the house 1 block up from my mother's. Seems that while I was in the shower, the 2 boys had walked past our house, turned the corner to the right, and walked past the across the street neighbor's house to the next house up, where Mr. B, a guy in his mid-70s, was also out in his yard. The 2 boys had approached him and struck up a conversation. Then they pulled out guns, robbed him in his own yard in broad daylight, and fled. Their first trip around the block was to choose a victim, apparently, and the second was to rob them. I got chills at just thinking that if I hadn't gone inside at the right time, I might have been one of the ones robbed. And I had no cash on me. What might they have done if their chosen victim didn't have what they wanted? What if my mother had come back home at just the wrong time? Because we're a small town, we heard through the grapevine that Mr. B and the cops already suspected who the boys were. There was a dog-fighting ring that was discovered right in the same neighborhood up the next block up. The boys were connected to that group. An unrelated meth house turned up 1 more block up from that, right across the street from the city elementary school. The town used to be idyllic and safe, but the wrong element made that no longer true. My mother left that town 2 years later, after living there for 50 years, and now lives in a much safer neighborhood in a much larger town closer to where I live. Boys who brazenly robbed an old man at gunpoint in his own front yard 3 days before Christmas? Let's never meet again. I'm a sophomore in high school, and I go to a public school, which also means I ride a bus with the same people every day. Now that we have that out the way, let's begin. Last year, I got separated from my 2 best friends, and I was put onto a new bus route, compared to the amount of people that were on the bus I rode with in 8th grade. This one was practically empty. There were only about 3 high schoolers including me, and around 5 or so middle schoolers. Everything was going great, until I decided to venture to the back of the bus. I was, and still am, a very anxious and antisocial person, so that was a big step for me to take. As the ride continues and everyone gets on the bus, everything is perfect until our last bus stop. Let's call this kid Weasel. Weasel was also in high school. He didn't say much until about a week into school, and he would start asking us questions. They weren't all that weird at first. They started out as questions such as, "What's your favorite color?" or "Who do you look up to?" Flash forward to the start of summer sports season. Weasel and I didn't get along at all, due to how weird he had become. He had started cracking homophobic and racist jokes, claimed he was a Nazi, wanted to murder all women like Hitler would with the Jews, given all of us vulgar names, and threatened my life, and his questions had become more and more personal and offensive. Weasel and I were the only two high schoolers on the bus, leaving me alone with him for about 20 minutes until the middle schoolers were released. He would often twitch violently, say my name over and over, grunt, move seats to get closer to me. Within a week of enduring this, I was scared shitless of him. I ended up sitting up front for the rest of the year until the middle schoolers got on. Fast forward to present day, I found out that his brother had lit a public bathroom on fire and has a history of anger issues would be joining us on the bus. Luckily, the bus driver puts middle schoolers up the front of the bus. Weasel only talks about his brother, asks those offensive questions, threatens me and my friends, and spews homophobic and racist slurs. On the first day of school, he threw my earbuds out the window, cut out a chunk of my hair, and brought a dead raccoon onto the bus. I am terrified that this kid will try to hurt me and my friends, and I don't know what else to do. So Weasel, let's not meet again. Even though I have to every day until my best friend gets his license in December. I am a 22-year-old male, and this all started last year when I bought my first house. It was a great deal for a piece of property in the area, since it was located next to a party house. Strange people were in and out all the time, lots of screaming at each other late at night. 2 times, they knocked on my door to borrow my phone to call the paramedics. It was unpleasant, but most of the time they were polite and didn't bother me. All but one person. This guy gave me weird vibes from the start. He cornered me one day when I was taking out the trash and introduced himself. I forgot his name almost immediately. I was in a hurry and didn't really want to talk. He started hounding me for my own name, which I gave reluctantly, not wanting to be a rude neighbor since I was going to be living there for a while. He then pressed me for my last name and who my parents were. None of this is particularly strange, since we are both First Nations and it's common for people to know each other through local family ties. And I look very young, and am often mistaken for a 16-year-old. And since he looked in his 40s, I didn't think much of it. Just someone my elder wanting to know if we were related or something. The whole time, he stood way too close, about 2 inches away from me. I started getting uncomfortable when he asked me if my parents were home. I live alone with my dog, but I didn't want him to know that. So I said they were at home. At their home, technically not a lie. And he then asked me if I worked, where I work, and I told him I had to go and just carried on my way. He asked if I wanted to come party, and motioned towards the seemingly empty party house. This was in the middle of the day. Super uncomfortable now, I ended up not answering and just going back to my house. A few times after that, he tried to talk to me again while taking out the garbage. And being the wimp I was back then, I just pretended I didn't hear him. He'd carry on the conversation himself, one-sided, or just repeat my name constantly in a bid to try and get my attention. But he never said anything particularly alarming. I figure I gave him an inch by talking to him this once, and now he was trying to buddy me up for a favor or something. I wish it were that, but it's not. 2 months later, my root cellar flooded because a water line to the party house broke. My cellar is a rusty metal staircase down into a concrete hole, with no other exits beyond the stairs which led up to my front yard, typically covered with a heavy hatch that sits as a part of my deck. I was in the middle of taking buckets of water out when he stood at the top of the cellar stairs and blocked my path. I was terrified. The cellar is soundproof because it's under my house, and I was home alone. My dog was in my house upstairs, which I didn't have direct access to. I didn't have my phone because I didn't want to get it wet, and he asked what I was doing. I told him my cellar was flooded, and he took a step down the stairs. I took a step back and into the water, and he advanced after me. I told him it was okay, I have it handled, and that he needed to be careful because the water could be electrically charged, and that I was safe because I was wearing rubber boots. Thankfully, this made him stop, and he left without another word. It was a big fib, because my power was out, but it was the only way out that I could think of at the time. I waited half a minute to make sure he was gone before booking it up the stairs and into my house. I borrowed a sump pump the next day from a family friend, so I wouldn't be stuck in the cellar alone for extended periods of time. He continued to try talking to me from time to time, but the water was shut off at the party house, so he was showing up less and less. Eventually the building was evicted. Some people still wandered around the property from time to time, but never him, and it was torn down some months later. Fall came around, and there was a knock at my door. Yep, the neighbor. He asked me if I remembered him. I told him I'd never seen him before in my life, and he told me to have a safe night and left. So, to my creepy neighbor's friend, let's not meet again. I always used to walk 4 blocks to school and back. Simple. Sometimes I liked to stop by my local park, which would be the 2nd block, and swing for a bit before carrying on. It was easy. Didn't bother anyone, nor did it bother me, at first. Cut to a few months ago. I was walking down the 1st block, and 2 grown men stopped me at the bus stop that they were waiting on. One smiled creepily at me and reached out, wanting me to fist bump them. I did so to be polite. The other merely asked if I spoke Spanish, to which I said no, but then the first man got up, and it appeared that he was going to advance towards me. I immediately panicked and went into fight or flight mode. He didn't do anything, just walked past me. I relaxed and continued on my way to school. It wasn't until the man who fist bumped me, Mark, started catcalling me in Spanish. I didn't know what exactly he was saying, but I knew he was making remarks about my butt. Not to mention Mark looked about 50 to 60 years old, and he was making inappropriate remarks about an underage minor of 17. I arrived at school safely and informed my teacher quickly about it. I haven't encountered him since, until a few days ago. I was at the park again, and decided to head home early. It was Halloween, so I knew the weirdos would be out and about soon. My city isn't the safest, and it's the 2nd place of having the highest crime rate. I was waiting for the stoplight to go green so that I could cross to the 1st block, which would be where I lived, of course. Then my heart sunk when I realized who was roaming across from me. Mark. At first I wasn't completely sure if the 2 incidents were months apart, but I could easily recognize his face, and I knew he remembered mine too. I had no choice but to cross if I wanted to get home, as it would be the quickest way possible. My anxiety flared up when I saw him grin widely at me and let out a maniacal laugh. He tried pinning me against the hedge, which would honestly be super pointless as I could jump over and get away if I needed to. My fight or flight kicked in when he tried reaching for my shoulder, and I ducked and ran quickly home, immediately informing my mother about it. I haven't been to school for a week due to it, and because my mum refuses to let me walk alone anymore. What makes this incident even more scary is that there have been increasing reports of human trafficking, which makes me fear what could have happened if I hadn't have gotten away. So Mark, if you do read this, let's never meet again.